You had the internet start as basically an ARPA project in the 1960s, and a lot of its early use cases were for the U.S. military for counterinsurgency purposes in Vietnam and elsewhere, aggregating social science data from universities. In the late 80s, ARPA/DARPA turns the internet over to the National Science Foundation, basically mediates through 4 universities, including Stanford. It gets rolled out in 1991 as the World Wide Web is a private. It's private now. It's open to the entire world. Very quickly, the U.S. national security state moved to take advantage of internet freedom around the world for purposes of advancing U.S. interests. Google started as a DARPA grant to Sergey Brin and Larry Page at Stanford back before it was Google, when they were doing search engine optimization research. They got DARPA funding at Stanford. They had a CIA and NSA advisor for purposes of basically a joint CIA-NSA program called the Massive Digital Data Program. Essentially, the intelligence community and our foreign policy establishment quickly deduced that birds of a feather would flock together online. And so they started this birds of a feather program to be able to identify, what people in Tunisia, they're all congregating on the same forums and blogs. This is before social media. Even then, there was this birds of a feather phenomenon with the kind of websites that foreign insurgency groups or political groups.
So this is 0203?
This is 95, actually.
Okay. Yeah.
So social media, you have Facebook in 2004, YouTube in 2005, Twitter in 2006, the iPhone in 2007. In 2007, a young guy shows up at the State Department's Office of Policy Coordination, the OPC. So the Office of Policy Coordination, or OPC, is the place in which U.S. overt and covert foreign policy is synchronized. It's the meeting point, essentially, between the State Department and the CIA. Jared Cohen was a very, very young guy when he showed up to OPC, very young. I think he was only 24, 26. His specialization was youth movements. And, this is a big part of the national security state, the foreign policy establishment. We essentially play 2 sides of a chessboard when it comes to managing the world empire. We've got the insurgency card, and we've got the counterinsurgency card. We support, we support insurgency efforts when we want to do regime change, or we want to destabilize or influence the ruling party in a particular country or region in order to be more pliant to U.S. interests. Or we play the counterinsurgency card, where we're trying to protect a certain political group in power from political or paramilitary threats coming from other political forces in that country. In the early days of the internet, internet freedom was a meme championed by the national security state to play the insurgency card, because you could have instant revolutions through the use. You could bypass state control over media. This is why it was the Pentagon who was funding, end-to-end encrypted chat, VPNs so that the local state government wouldn't be able to track the IP addresses. Tor, you name it. It's internet anonymity, freedom on the internet, was a DoD, State Department, IC initiative from 1991 until 2014, essentially. I'll get to that inflection point in a second here. And it wasn't until it started to backfire politically that they transitioned to a counterinsurgency model. And that ended up having massive spillover at home, because they started to view populism as a sort of insurgency threat that censorship could solve. Now, I'll get to that in a second. So Jared Cohen is basically this, youth revolutionary guru to the boomers, if you will, at the State Department in 2007, a Republican, a Bush appointee under Condoleezza Rice. He looks around and he sees all these 40, 50, 60-year-olds, and he says, why are we planning operations through U.S. embassies or consulates or CIA station houses? Everybody we want to mobilize in Egypt, everybody we want to mobilize Middle East, North Africa, Southeast, everyone we want to mobilize is on Facebook. They're on Twitter. What are we doing? The analog. We need a new digital statecraft doctrine. We need something that would go on to be called Diplomacy 2.0. or the doctrine of digital statecraft. And this represented a sort of merger of social media with traditional 20th century insurgency work for purposes of creating a favorable political ecosystem in every target country. If that's your portfolio country at state, you're going to want to be implementing Diplomacy 2.0 to try to, whatever your checklist is of priority items vis-a-vis that country's own policies. So that culminated in the Arab Spring. In the early 2010s, you had this sort of period where one after another adversary country in Middle East, North Africa underwent a sudden and unexpected social media revolution, culminating in regime change, where everyone on the neo axis of quasi evil in that region was replaced by youth movements powered by Facebook and Twitter. At that moment, Jared Cohen was named one of the top 50 most powerful people in Washington by Time magazine. Young, I think he was like 28 years old. Could have done anything, but he goes over. This is now something like 2012 to, at the time, a mid-sized company that was not even in the top 100 by market cap. It was number 120, and that was Google. And at the time in Washington, there was a lot of what is he? This kid could be president one day. What is he doing going over to Google? Well, Google had just created a one-person think tank called Google Ideas. And that one person was Jared Cohen, whose job was supposed to be to sit in a room all day and think about all the big, beautiful, creative ways that Google could use its proprietary data and empire it had built on the data and search side to solve complex geopolitical problems, i.e., essentially to become a sort of shadow State Department using the very vehicle of the locus point between state and CIA. Now, this comes into the censorship story because we live in an age of AI censorship. Over 90, something between 98 and 99%, depending on the platform, of all proactive content takedowns online are first flagged by AI at the content level. It was 0% before 2017, zero. The only AI censorship that existed before the story I'm about to describe here was you had things like child porn, right? Where there were AI techniques around near duplicate hashing, where you would compare, you'd have a filter that would automatically compare an image to whether the FBI had uploaded a comparable child porn image in a database or something like that. But there was nothing for speech, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, targeted abuse and harassment. Any one of the terms, none of that was proactively flagged by the words you said using AI. That all changed with Jared Cohen. Jared Cohen paid very special attention to the events around Brexit and the U.S. 2016 presidential election, and used Jigsaw. Google Ideas renamed itself to what's currently called Google Jigsaw, to develop what was previously a DARPA. DARPA originally funded this program to use something called natural language processing. It's an AI technique to examine words to assess sort of the political topography of different kinds of narratives or doctrines online. You can pull out the prefixes, the suffixes, the hashtags, the sort of the dialect of an idea, almost the way sort of academic jargon gave rise to sort of a sophisticated sort of dialect of Marxism. There's a similar thing with respect to MAGA or with respect to ISIS, dialect. But if you can simply train your models on that political ideology, you can then use that for content moderation purposes in highly sophisticated and targeted ways. Jared Cohen at Jigsaw, immediately after the 2016 election, turned this DARPA-funded work that was originally funded by the DoD to look at the ways ISIS was recruiting on Facebook and Twitter to do it. They trained it on three basically sets of political training data. The 2016 election and Donald Trump, the events in Brexit and around Nigel Farage, the Brexit Party, and the Brexit vote, and climate change was the third one. And you could actually go onto their AI censorship. Basically, they had a website, they had a whole sort of API plug. You could actually go in and you could see the toxicity score that was attached to any statement around those three topic areas. It was public. You could even go on their site and do that. They ended up rolling that out to the social media companies. It ended up becoming standard. And then there became a gold rush to develop more and more sophisticated AI domestic censorship superweapons for control over political discourse. And I watched that happen over multiple years. And currently, now it's funded by the government. You have a $40 million program at the National Science Foundation for exactly this, to stop people from talking about COVID origins.
Where are the places where the research and work on this is happening outside of the formal four corners of the tech companies themselves? We've mentioned the government, the State Department, National Science Foundation, but I know that there are academic institutions that play a very heavy role in this. Tell me a little bit about those.
Yes. What's happening now is essentially it's sort of a rhyming to the historical version in the analog sector. During the Cold War, the universities played a huge role in the propaganda effort, both at home and abroad. Social science research captured academics. There was, without going too deep into the details there, universities, social sciences in the universities have been completely rejuvenated by this focus on domestic censorship from the U.S. government. There was always a sort of so I'll give you an example. So my foundation has documented 42 U.S. colleges and universities who've received over 65 grants in the past 18 months just from the National Science Foundation alone, totaling $40 million just for AI censorship work to develop fast, precise, and comprehensive content moderation models for mis and disinformation. So you have
was the casus belli for most of this COVID
and electoral skepticism is another one. Basically, people have a problem with mail-in ballots or early voting drop boxes, or there's a whole sort of democracy bend to this. But it's unsurprisingly diversified around a bunch of pet policies of the national security state and certain political factions as well. Some of this bleeds into climate misinformation models, immigration misinformation. So, but by far and away, the top two targets for mis and disinformation are COVID skepticism and electoral skepticism is basically the way they phrase it. But it's proxies for you're having a wrong opinion on COVID and supporting Donald Trump is basically. I mean, when it's not, you don't need to X-ray through it too deep to when you start looking at their slide decks and their video presentations. They're literally flashing images of Trump as they're presenting their pitch for $5 million in taxpayer funding for what kind of misinformation they're doing. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's cartoonishly naked, but what you have is essentially this onboarding of civil society, the universities, nonprofits, community leaders, and foundations as a sort of censorship mercenary army. Now, not to be too over the top or whatnot about this, but the church committee hearings unearthed in the 1970s about 20 years worth of psychological behavioral modification work that the intelligence community was doing around, people talk about MK Ultra and whatnot. And, there's a lot of attention to, the use of drugs or whatnot for that. But a lot of it was just about studying the social science of crowd behavior, how to influence hearts and minds and crowds, principally, because that was a big part of our Cold War effort to try to win insurgency and counterinsurgency scuffles in Soviet satellite states in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia. It was after the 1948 UN Declaration on Human Rights, you couldn't take over territory by force anymore. Everything moved subkinetic. It was about political control. And in a democratic country, that meant hearts and minds. So we had a huge positive media ecosystem with respect to Voice of America, Free Liberty, Radio America, the whole Wisner's Wurlitzer, the sort of the media relations between legacy media and the national security state. What's happening now is a terrifying parallel to that. The universe that were just in, for example, I just mentioned MK Ultra. I mean, there were 45 universities who received government funding for what was essentially a CIA, DOD psychological influence project. Well, my foundation, FFO, has documented 42 just in the past 18 months who've gotten government funding for psychological behavioral modification on belief in designated mis and disinformation topics. They're basically trying to approximate the kind of bumper cars on democracy that existed before the internet, when the gatekeepers to information were much closer to the national security state than some 18-year-old kid with 6 million Twitter followers or whatever. But they had a real concern. And if you turn back the clock, you can see 4-star generals and former CIA, NSA directors in 2019 telling the German Marshall Fund, telling the Atlantic Council at all these conferences, what are we going to do if the New York Times is reduced to a medium-sized Facebook page? What happens when the back doors, the checks and balances on democracy, the national security state used to have? What happens if people get to set their own foreign policy? What happens if we lose control of the domestic drivers of foreign policy? And that's essentially the story here. It's not even a right-wing, left-wing thing, because they were afraid of Jeremy Corbyn and an early iteration of Bernie Sanders as well.